Hi and welcome back. This week we wrap up chapter 6 by talking about the categorical syllogism with respect to how you can complete an incomplete argument, how you can take an argument with too many terms and reduce it, and how you can test all of the subsequent standard form arguments for validity using both the rules of the syllogism and the modern and traditional interpretations of the universal in the Venn diagram. Remember, the techniques that we're developing are really useful for us in terms of dealing with argument reconstruction, dealing with argument organization, and understanding how how a valid argument works or how an argument fails. So let's get started. Okay, so as you can see, we've covered sections A through E, and you'll see when we begin looking at F, G, and H that we've covered at least some of F, and G and H rely on your understanding of A as well as diagramming and E, the rules of the syllogism. So let's go ahead and get started discussing ordinary language arguments, enthymemes, and Sorities, and then we'll be done with chapter 6. So we already know from as far back as the beginning of chapter 5 that any sentence we rewrite into standard form for the categorical proposition is going to include a quantifier, it's going to reflect a quality, it's going to have a subject class, a copula, and a predicate class. And that is reflected in one of the four forms that we've been working with. The A proposition, all SRP, the E proposition, no SRP, the particular proposition, I, some SRP, that's the affirmative, and the particular negative, the O proposition, some S are not P. So when you're reorganizing your argument, you need to pick out whether or not we're dealing with an affirmative or a negative sentence. You need to identify that. You need to pick out the subject class and the predicate class. And then you need to make sure that your subject and predicate classes are written in nouns or noun phrases. So one of the things that you want to think about doing is making your each of your sentences as economical as possible. So one of the ways that we do this is we eliminate needless words. We take words that are synonymous and we replace them with one word with the same meaning for the synonym. We will, wherever possible, use conversion, obversion, and contraposition to simplify propositions. And then, of course, when we're dealing with the argument itself, we need to make sure that our argument reflects standard form for a syllogism, which involves writing out the major premise first. The major premise includes the major term. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. The minor premise includes the minor term. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. And that you have a copula separating out the subject and predicate classes. So we have an example that is in standard form insofar as it is already written out in terms of major premise and minor premise. But notice that we have a complement in front of each of the respective predicates for the major and the minor premise. So what we want to do is see if we can rework the sentence so that we have either a sentence that is that involves fewer negations. Sorry, I stumbled. I was thinking about the minor premise that involve fewer negations than what you see already, or that is otherwise rewritten in standard form in terms of the traditional approach. And what I mean by that is if you can get each of your sentences to look like it does when it is an A, an E, an I, or an O, then you've got your sentence in a form that is easiest to work with, arguably easiest to work with. Okay, so we can obvert the first premise, some G are non-H, and we get some G are not H. And we can also obvert the second premise, no E are non-G becomes all E are G. And then the conclusion is already in standard form. It's an O proposition. So notice we have some G are not H, all E are G, some E are not H. Notice also that the syllogism violates rule number 1. The middle term is not distributed in at least one premise. Let's go ahead and diagram this as well so that you can see not only by way of the rules, but also by way of Venns for the modern and traditional interpretations, how this argument fails. Okay, so first, wow, that's an ugly circle. Sorry about that. You're used to this though, aren't you? Doesn't matter how many times I use the bamboo pen. I do a rotten job of drawing with it. All right, so I've got M, S, and P. I'm going to go ahead and take this argument and just put the relevant terms, the letters for the terms, over what we have. Remember, we diagram as follows. Universals are first, and then particulars. We know already that we diagram only our premises. So all S are M involves shading the area of S outside of M. And then we have some M are not P. I'm putting an X on the line here because the M that is outside of P, let me go ahead and change the color so you can see this. When we're saying that there is at least one M that's outside of P, we're dealing with this area that I've outlined in green. But we don't know if the M that is not a P is also not an S or is an S. Consequently, since we don't necessarily have an S in this area of, or sorry, an X in this area of S that is outside of P, our conclusion doesn't show up. And the same thing happens on the traditional interpretation. Once again, we diagram the S area outside of M, and then we assume a member of the subject class. Remember that we assume existential import by way of putting an X in a circle. That X is on the line because the subject class is dumped into the predicate class, which I'm outlining here with the pen. But we don't know if that X that we're assuming exists is outside of P or inside of P. Then our second premise, our major premise, but the second premise that we diagram, some M are not P. Once again, we know that it's an M that may or may not be an S. So the argument fails on rule number 1, and you can tell from both diagramming methods, both techniques, that the argument fails. Here's a prettier Venn, and this is the Venn that is drawn according to the modern interpretation. Remember also that as much as possible, when you're paraphrasing your ordinary language arguments, you need to be as economical as can be, but make sure that you pay attention to negations. Make sure also that you remember how you deal with non-standard language, and that is a reference back to chapter 5, section I. So let's start by identifying the conclusion. We have the following argument: drug tests shouldn't be used. Of course, if something is reliable, then it should be used, but unfortunately, drug tests aren't reliable. I think it's clear at this point in our work together that you can tell the first sentence is the conclusion. The language, although not explicitly the language of indicator words and phrases, of course and but, is still language that tells us that there's evidence coming up or more evidence coming up. In addition, so once you've got your conclusion, drug tests shouldn't be used. In addition, you need to look at the fact that we have in our second sentence the conditional claim, if something is reliable, then it should be used. And we should remember that the if-then statement is standardly translated as a universal, and since there's no negation here, it's a universal affirmative. Now go ahead and cast your eyes down to the conclusion as it's written in standard form. No drug tests are things that should be used. Now look at the original. Drug tests shouldn't be used. Whenever you have an implicit, that is an unstated quantifier, you should think of a universal. There are exceptions, but it's almost always a universal that's implied when you have a sentence where a class of things is asserted without an explicit quantifier. Notice also that we are denying drug tests should be used, so we need a negation. Hence, all are not becomes no are. No drug tests are things that should be used. Remember, we need a predicate that is written out as a noun or a noun phrase. And we also have the second the second sentence we already talked about as a universal. All reliable things are things that should be used. And then again, drug tests aren't reliable. That is a universal negative. This argument violates rule number 2. The major term is distributed in the in the conclusion, but not in its corresponding premise. Let's go ahead and diagram this so that you can see with the modern interpretation that the argument fails. And I'm using the modern interpretation because there won't be a difference in this argument between diagramming on the modern versus the traditional. So we have our major term, our minor term, and our middle term. All M are P. No S are M. And the conclusion, no S or P, does not appear. If it did, we would have the area of overlap shaded S and P. Right? So just as a reminder, when you're dealing with ordinary language arguments that you're translating or rewriting into standard form for the categorical syllogism, you're going to use a number of the techniques that we learned in Chapter 5. Here is another example. Everyone except those under 18 years of age is eligible to vote. My brother John is older than 18, so he can vote. Now, first, we've got U for persons under 18 years of age, E for persons eligible to vote, and J for persons identical to John. I hope you can see how we end up with the final articulation of this argument. First, let's go back to the acceptive propositions cases where are in Chapter 5, where you are required to translate two propositions rather than one. So everyone except is going to involve a universal negative and a universal affirmative with a complement in front of the subject class. So everyone except those under 18 years of age is eligible to vote. That means that no one under 18 years of age is eligible to vote, and all non-persons under 18 years of age are eligible to vote. So let's write this out together. No persons under 18 years of age are eligible to vote, and all non-persons under 18 years of age are eligible to vote. We also know that all persons identical to John are persons older than age 18. So what do we need to do? Well, persons who are under 18 are going to be those persons that of which John is a member. It's going to be among those persons of which John is a member. And then the conclusion is all persons identical to John are persons eligible to vote. Now, do you notice that we have here 3 premises? That's because everyone except those under 18 years of age is eligible to vote is going to break out, as we saw, into 2 propositions. So the question then becomes, how do we reduce our terms so that we can get to where we want to go, namely to the conclusion that John is eligible, and to determine if that's valid? Now, before we leave this page, I've gone ahead and erased what I wrote originally, and I want to say something about the complement and how we're going to deal with that when it comes to diagramming. If it's the case that you cannot work some sort of obversion, conversion, or contraposition in order to reduce the negations, then what you'll do is have a class, in this case, that you label non-U, that is, persons not under the age of 18. So let's take a look at another example so that you can see what it is that I'm talking about in action. Whenever I take my umbrella with me, the weather stays sunny. I didn't take my umbrella with me today, so it's going to rain. Now, we need to reorganize this argument so that we can tell explicitly what our quantity and quality are for each of the propositions, as well as the subject and predicate classes for each proposition. So U is going to be, the capital letter U is going to be times I take my umbrella with me, R times when it rains, T times identical to today. Notice that in doing this work using U, R, and T, we've already eliminated an additional term. This is the weather staying sunny, or times when it's sunny. So we get the following. All times I take my umbrella are times when it's non-rainy. All times that are today are times when it's are times when I haven't taken my umbrella with me. Therefore, all times identical with today are rainy times. Now, you can see that we have a U and a non-U in the left-hand version of the argument, and we need to make our terms consistent. We also have a non-R and an R respectively in the major, premise, and the conclusion, and we need to make those articulations of the major term consistent. So in the first case, what we do is swap the subject and predicate classes and add the complement to each. In other words, the major premise has been contraposed. Remember, contraposition is valid for A and E A and O propositions. We've also contraposed the minor premise. So just in case you're not exactly sure how we got from the formulation on the left to the formulation on the right, let's walk through the process together. Make sure the pen is up. Okay, so in the middle here, where the arrow is, I'm going to write the original contraposition. So all U are non-R becomes all non-R are non-U. Remember, contraposition involves taking the predicate and putting it in the subject position, taking the subject and putting it in the predicate position. The complement is part of this predicate class. Then, when we get to the final formulation, the two negations drop out. So now that our terms are consistent, and I've just erased what I wrote so that you can see this clearly, take a look at the middle term. The middle term is non-U. So this is the class of things non-U. We diagram all R are non-U, all T are non-U, and we find that the conclusion, all T are R, does not bear out, and that's because, as you know, if the argument were valid, area 2 would also be shaded, but it's not. Let's go back to our original work in chapter 1 to identify the conclusion, if there is one. Remember, an enthymeme can be an argument, that is missing a conclusion, missing a premise, maybe even both. So if you take a look at this example, you'll see, let me get the pen going, you'll see that we have the premise indicator word for. For tells us that what's coming up is a premise. That means this first sentence, I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, is going to be the conclusion. So let's reformulate this a little bit. I'm going to say that all segregation ordinances, which I'm just going to abbreviate as SO, are things that should be disobeyed. Now we'll probably want to firm up this language a little bit more, and by firm up I mean sharpen up with something more exacting than things. Now let's take a look at what the they are. They are morally wrong. They are the segregation ordinances. So segregation ordinances are morally wrong. And I'm just abbreviating morally wrong with MW. So we've got our minor term and our minor premise. Now we need to think about things that should be disobeyed as our major premise, and where that should go in order to make this argument valid. So how about something like this? Whatever is morally wrong is something that should be disobeyed. Segregation ordinances are morally wrong, so they should be disobeyed. And now let's take a look at the answer and let's see how the language is firmed up. First, we've got the missing premise. Things that are morally wrong should be disobeyed, but more specifically, laws, morally wrong laws, are things that should be disobeyed. Then we can rework the argument to get the following. All laws that are morally wrong are things that should be disobeyed. All segregation ordinances are morally wrong laws. Therefore, all segregation ordinances are things that should be disobeyed. So one of the things that's great about working with enthymemes is they force us into making an argument's structure explicit, and it gives us good practice with generating a valid argument. Last, we need to talk about Sorities. When we have chains of arguments, we have arguments that involve intermediate conclusions. And what we need to do is work through the inference to that conclusion so that we can get to the second argument that's in this chain of reasoning, and therefore finally get to the conclusion. So take a look at the argument in blue on the left. Notice that you have 3 premises. You need to get rid of one of those. So what you do is you first take the 2 premises, the first 2 premises, all DRC and all ARD, and you draw a conclusion from it. That conclusion then becomes the major premise for the second part of the argument, where you will include that third premise of the original argument. All right, before we can deal with this argument, we need to reduce our terms. So all j are non-k is going to become no j are k. Do you see that we've obverted the first premise? No e are non-j becomes all e are j. Again, we've obverted the premise. And then some k r g. The conclusion, some g are non-e. Now, before we can go anywhere with this argument, we need to, in other words, before we can get to the conclusion, we need to take our first two premises and draw the relevant conclusion. No j are k, all e are j. The j, the middle term, drops out, and we end up with no e r k. Our third, but now our second premise in this second part of the argument is some k r g. All right, let's clean this up and see what we've got. Now, notice that in the rewrite that's cleaned up, you have in the conclusion at the top, some g are not e, and that is a legitimate move for us to make because we're talking about an O claim, right? We're saying there is at least one g and it's a non-e, or it's outside of e. So we end up with, as our first argument, after we've rewritten the first two premises in blue, we end up with no j r k, all e r j, therefore no e r k. That's our intermediate conclusion. It becomes the major premise of the argument, no e r k, some g r k, therefore some g are not e. Now, let's ask a question. Is the argument valid? Well, let's begin, and by asking if that argument is valid, what I'm doing is referring to this, but also ultimately the original. So the middle term is distributed at least once. There is a term distributed in the conclusion, E. It's also distributed in its corresponding premise. We do not have two negative premises. We have one. We have a negative premise and a negative conclusion. And then lastly, we don't have two universal premises, so rule number 6 is not applicable. Let's go ahead and diagram based on our modern interpretation. No ERK, which is going to be the same as no PRM. And then some GRK is an X in this area of overlap. If it helps, we've got S, P, and M. Right? No ERK, no PRM. Some GRK, that is some S or M. And then the conclusion appears because the conclusion says there is at least one G that's not an E, which is to say there's at least one S that's not a P. This argument is valid on both interpretations. You did it. You made it through chapter 6. We just have one more system of logic to study. This is called propositional logic or sentential logic or natural deduction. We'll get into that next week. But first, we're going to take some time to practice with the material that we've been studying. And Al says hi. Anyway, we're going to take some time to practice with enthymemes and Sorities and translating, rewriting arguments from ordinary language into propositional logic, into categorical proposition notation and standard form for the categorical syllogism. So Al's very excited about it, and I hope you are too. Congratulations, you've made it this far. Keep up the good work.